Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Michael Cremo, author of Forbidden Archaeology, Human Devolution, and the soon-to-be published My Science, My Religion, all of which offer radical and profound insights into what Michael believes is the true nature of human origins, identity, and destiny. Darwin's theory of evolution has thus far failed to explain the origin and nature of life on Earth, and yet it is Darwinian thinking, with its emphasis on competition, conflict and survival of the fittest, that dominates our governments, our education systems and thus our entire society. We are told that life on this planet arose randomly from a primordial ooze, for no reason, no purpose and devoid of design. But how did single-celled organisms become the complex organic structures which populate the world today? What series of genetic mutations actually took place, and where is the evidence for them? Contrary to popular perception, Darwin's theory of evolution has answered none of these questions in any scientifically proven way, nor can it even begin to address the nature of mind or the origins of consciousness. From junk DNA to dark matter, reductionist materialistic science has left us with more questions than answers. For the sake of the planet and all life on it, we urgently need to open our minds to new possibilities, and Michael Cremo offers us many of these. Hello and welcome, Michael Cremo, and thank you very much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm happy to be with you and all your listeners.
Excellent. Now, Michael, we're here today to discuss some of the issues raised in your book, Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. And although that was published some time ago, really, I mean, the work that you're doing is an ongoing project, exploring, looking for answers where presently they're mainly just questions. And the background to all this stems from another book which you co-authored with Richard L. Thompson some years ago called Forbidden Archaeology. And that basically set out that over the past 2 centuries, researchers had found bones and artifacts showing that humans, just like ourselves, existed on Earth not thousands of years ago, not even hundreds of thousands, but millions of years ago. However, the scientific establishment has ignored this information because it contradicts the dominant paradigm, which is the characterized by Darwin's theory of evolution. And in Human Devolution, which is kind of the sequel to this, you set out the big question, okay, if we didn't evolve from apes, where did we come from? And a short quote from yourself says, we did not evolve up from matter. Instead, we devolved or came down from the realm of pure consciousness or spirit. Now, before we dive into some of the details here, perhaps you could just sum up, just elaborate on the overall concept of the book a little bit.
Well, the overall concept of the book, Human Devolution, is that we did not evolve up from matter, as most scientists now believe. I think it's important to understand, even before we ask the question, where did we come from? Where did human beings come from? We should first of all ask the question, what is a human being or any other living thing? And today, most scientists are going to say that we're just machines made of molecules. That's all we really are. But I think if we look deeply into the scientific evidence, we'll see it's more reasonable to say that we're composed of 3 things. Ordinary matter, molecules, yes, that's part of what we are. But beyond that, there is a subtle mind element with some very unusual powers like extrasensory perception, telekinesis, things of that sort. So, and then beyond that, there is the conscious self, which is beyond matter completely. So, when I speak of mind and consciousness, I don't mean temporary byproducts of bioelectrical activity in the brain. I mean real things with their own independent existence apart from matter. So I think it's important to establish that, first of all, that we're something more than just machines made of molecules. And once we've understood that, then it's easy to see that our origin is beyond matter. As conscious beings, we originally exist on what I call the level of pure consciousness. And it's possible to remain there, but if a conscious self descends from that level of pure consciousness into the world of matter, then it becomes covered by matter, and those coverings are what we call bodies. So that process by which the pure conscious self comes in contact with matter and becomes covered by matter is what I call devolution. We don't evolve up from matter, we devolve or come down into matter from a position of pure consciousness. So what I'm saying is that matter does not produce consciousness, but matter can cover consciousness temporarily.
Mm-hmm. Now, all of this flies in the face of what I referred to a few moments ago as the dominant paradigm, which is Darwinian theory of evolution, which purports to explain life on Earth, its origins, how it came to be as it is, says a lot about where it's going, allegedly. However, what people often forget, is lay people, scientists, all of us, is that Darwin's theory is just that. It's a theory. It is not proven that this is how life on Earth came to be and quote-unquote evolved. The answers are not in. But we have in Darwin's theory of evolution a paradigm that is powerful, and it's very deep-rooted, woven throughout everything, all aspects of our lives and thinking, though we may not, on the surface realize it. So anything that questions this, and we see this in the media all the time, anything that calls this into question, however well-reasoned and however scientifically based, tends to get ignored, thrown out, vilified, and no doubt, I've read criticism of your ideas along these lines. So perhaps you could just explain why Darwin's theory is not what it purports to be.
Well, first of all, I just want to say, if somebody honestly believes that the Darwinian theory of evolution is the best way to explain the origin and purpose of life, I respect that. In this sense, I respect the right of each individual to make up their own mind about these questions. But what I do object to is the Darwinist influencing governments to give them an absolute monopoly in the education systems around the world so that only their idea can be taught as having anything to do with the truth about the origin of life and the purpose of life. So that's what I object to. Not that any particular scientist or individual accepts the Darwinian theory of evolution. I think everyone has a right to make up their own minds about these things. But what I do object to is them using government to give themselves a monopoly in the education systems and scientific establishments so that there isn't any real diversity and people really don't get a choice in the education systems. Any alternatives are forced to exist on the margins of society. So, that's what I object to. Now, if you ask me, well, why personally am I not a supporter of the Darwinian theory of evolution, I've got answers for that. First of all, a big part of their idea is that life comes from matter. Life and consciousness come from matter. They think that in the beginning there weren't any living things. There were just chemicals floating around in the Earth's early oceans and bodies of water. And they believe that somehow or other, some of those chemicals combine together to form the first self-reproducing organism. And this is something that you'll see in every biology textbook. You'll see it on countless scientific television programs. You'll hear that idea being promoted as the absolute truth. But the real fact is, no scientist today has ever shown exactly how chemicals could combine together to make up the first living thing. Nobody has explained exactly which chemicals combine together in exactly which way to form exactly what first self-reproducing organism. So the theory is in trouble right from the start. The second reason I object to it is that once you grant the existence of some first self-reproducing, single-celled organism, there is no real explanation of how you go from that first single-celled organism to creatures like human beings with complex organic structures. We're told it's happened by evolution, and by that they mean, well, somehow or other, some of these single-celled organisms started sticking together in multi-celled organisms. Exactly how that happened, nobody has really explained. But they say it happened. And then they believe that at a certain point, these multicellular organisms start reproducing in sexual fashion, making use of DNA, genes. And they think the DNA, the genome, contains information that specifies the structures that will develop in an organism. And they think if you modify the DNA through mutations and gene duplication and other processes, that this will change the structure of the organism. And say, for example, if you want to explain, well, how did the eye come into existence? Well, first of all, they would say there was some tiny little organism that didn't have a developed eye. Perhaps it just had a light-sensitive spot somewhere on its head. And they believe that some mutation took place in the genetic structure of that simple organism that didn't have a developed eye that led to the first step towards a more developed eye. Perhaps that light-sensitive spot became a depression. And then there was another mutation in the genome of that creature, maybe thousands of years later, that resulted in a clear membrane covering that light-sensitive depression, and so on and so forth, until finally you get the developed human eye with all of its incredible powers. And basically that's the explanation that you see in all the textbooks. But if you ask, can you tell me exactly what was the genetic structure of that simple organism that didn't have an eye? Can you tell me exactly what series of genetic mutations had to take place over many millions of years that led to the formation of the developed human eye? You'll find no such detailed explanation in any scientific textbook or scientific publication. So that's another problem with the theory. A third problem is the origin of consciousness. Consciousness is something that we all experience. It's the most real fact of our existence. If I weren't conscious and you weren't conscious, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So no one has explained exactly how consciousness arises in organisms. They would say, if you organize the molecules in the brain in a sufficiently complex way, it generates consciousness. But no one has ever actually demonstrated that, how you can combine chemicals together so that consciousness is the result. So a lot of the theory of evolution is based on accepting things on faith that have not been scientifically proven in any rigorous scientific way. And the other point is that there's a lot of fossil evidence that contradicts that whole picture. As I pointed out in my book, Forbidden Archaeology, according to the Darwinian theory of evolution, humans evolved fairly recently on Earth, having evolved from more primitive ape-like human ancestors, which evolved from primitive apes and monkeys, which evolved from primitive mammals, which evolved from reptiles, which evolved from amphibians, which evolved from fish, which evolved from single-celled creatures in the ocean, which came into existence from chemicals. There's a lot of fossil evidence contradicting that whole picture. There's evidence that humans like us have been present for millions and millions of years on Earth, actually going back to the very beginnings of the history of life. So you have a lot of problems with the Darwinian theory of evolution. First of all, they can't show how life first arose on this planet. Once the first living thing did arise, they haven't explained in any strictly scientific way how complex organisms developed from the first simple organisms, and they haven't explained the origin of consciousness, and there's a lot of fossil evidence that contradicts their whole picture. Now, that said, I understand that the theory has some plausibility for people who are willing to accept a lot of things as being plausible rather than strictly demonstrated in any scientific way. And I don't have any objection if there are scientists who want to pursue these things on the basis of that theory. But I would just ask for two things. They should just admit that they really haven't proven things in according to the terms that their very theory demands. They haven't shown how life comes from chemicals. They haven't shown in a detailed way how the complex features of organisms have come about by the processes they have made part of their theory, namely genetic variation acted on by natural selection in the course of reproduction with modification. I mean, it's a plausible idea, but it hasn't been strictly demonstrated in a scientific way.